Hi, welcome to Variables 101. Thanks for coming. If you're looking for QuakeCon, how to frag noobs, that's down on the first floor, in case anybody's in the wrong place. My name is Mike Duncan. A little bit about me. I am a lead application developer with Syllabus Consulting, FileMaker certified. I helped architect our hosting offering now too. And I'm also AWS certified. I live in Carmel, Indiana. I know most of the other places around the country it's pronounced Carmel, especially for you people in California. But in Indiana we say Carmel. And I live there with my wife and kids. My wife's a teacher, so that's kind of why I'm going with the scholastic kind of theme here. So first up, here's a syllabus. Here's some of the stuff we're going to cover. And I've got some fun stuff for us to get to, but we're going to start out with some of the basics first. So let's just dive into it. Okay, so what are variables? Well, they were first introduced in FileMaker 8, and here's the definition from the FileMaker help pages. Variables provide a temporary location for storing data, which can then be accessed from any context in the file. And that's a good thing because that's pretty much in line with the definition of variables from like a computer science kind of meaning. So it's really accessible for somebody else that learns about variables in other languages. How do we apply them? It kind of fits in with how that goes. So what are some concerns using variables? There's memory usage, right? They do take up some space in memory. And we're going to talk about scope too. So more about scope. Variables are defined by their scope in FileMaker. They're limited to a single file, right? So if you think of a file as an application, they don't go with outside of that scope. So at the maximum, you're limited to using them in the same file. They can persist for the duration of a session, right? And your session means when you first log on until the time that you log out. So in that, there's some different kinds of variables in FileMaker, right there, and they're defined by their scope. First, we have global variables, and a global variable is denoted with a double $sign, right? And that's the one that's going to be available application-wide, or not application meaning your FileMaker file, right? So file-wide. The second type is the local variable. So these are denoted with a single $sign. So the scope of a local variable will be just the duration of wherever you're going to use it. So if you're running a script, it's going to live for the lifetime of that script. If you're running it in a calculation, it's going to run within that calculation. Then the third type is a let variable. These are kind of important, and a lot of people overlook these. They forget about the let variable. These are used in a let statement, right, which is you use in the calculation engine. So how do we set a variable? Right, there's a couple different ways to set a variable, define and set a variable. The first we'll talk about is in a script step, and this is the most straightforward, right? There's a script step, set variable. Right? It's pretty self-explanatory. There's a couple other script steps where you can actually set and define variables, but for the most part, we'll use set variable. And then, as I mentioned, the calculation, right? Using a let statement or a let function. Really important thing to note here is you've got access to set a variable anywhere that you've got access to the calculation engine. So that's pretty powerful, right? So in field definitions, even in layout objects, anywhere you bring up the calculation dialog, you've got the opportunity to set and define a variable. That leads me to my next point of, well, just because you can, it doesn't mean you necessarily should. Right, you don't necessarily want to set variables in layout objects or just anywhere in your solution. You kind of want to, and this goes more to best practices. I mean, and for your own sanity, I tend to try and keep setting variables in scripts, right? That's your business logic. Also the slide about the MVC, right? The model view controller. So variables tend to be more in your controller portion, right? They're in your business logic. With that being said, once we have a variable set, then how do we unset it? Well, unsetting a variable is easy. We just set it to an empty string, and then we don't even see it anymore, right? Where we see variables set, they go away. So in that sense, they're kind of ephemeral, right? You can set it, you can unset it. So talking more about the considerations when we define variables, there's kind of maintaining the variables that we define. They do take up a little bit of memory, but it's pretty small, right? They're basically text. And it's generally not a concern. I have had some comments from other developers, because I tend to set a lot of variables, and one of the comments was, I don't like seeing a storm of variables in my data viewer, but I don't mind. There's ways of organizing that, and I'll show you. Bringing up the data viewer, and the nice thing now with 17 is pretty much everybody's got a copy of FileMaker Advanced. So we've got access to the script debugger and the data viewer. There used to be more of a security concern. It's not so much anymore. There is a little lock on it, so your ability to view and change variables in the data viewer is going to be dependent on your credentials that you authenticate to the file with. So naming a variable, there are some restrictions on naming. And these are basically the same restrictions that there are on naming fields, right? Here's the dialog, kind of tells you here's the characters you can't use when you're naming a variable. Kind of the exception is the square brackets there, which are used to denote the the variable repetition. And those work pretty much just like field repetitions, right? Except we don't need to predefine. Like if you go into fields and you define repetitions, you have to define them right there, how many repetitions you're using. With variables, it's ad hoc. You can set a variable repetition using those square brackets in a let statement. We'll show that too. So that's kind of the exception to that rule. Although technically it's not in the name, it's the repetition. Repetitions are not supported with variables in a couple different locations, right? Merge variables, file paths, and find requests. So let's break out in our first demo. And here we're just going to bring up a script editor, and we're going to set a variable using the script set variable. We're going to give it a name. So in this case, we're just going to set a local variable with a single $sign. We're just going to do something simple, right? First name, last name. Right, pretty straightforward. And then I added a exit script step there, so when we bring up our script debugger, we'll be able to step through it and use the data viewer to see as these things get set. So when we run the script, right, we're going to step through. And then you see on the data viewer, there's our variable right there. You can't even use it in the data viewer. You can go in and edit the content, but generally I don't do that. You wouldn't want to do that here. You want to set it in your script, right? There's the lock I mentioned before to authenticate. So even if you're testing something out, you logged in as somebody else, you could authenticate there if you needed to, just to be able to see the variables getting set. Otherwise, you wouldn't even see them, right? When we exit the script, that was a local variable, so that one goes away, right? The scope was just the lifetime of that script. Okay, so let's go back in. We're going to change things up a little bit. So this time, we're going to set a variable using a let statement. So let statement, and I kind of like to format it a little bit just for a little more readability. Okay, so if indent it a little bit, we're going to define a variable here. This is going to be a let variable, right? So we don't need a $sign in front of it. And I just pasted in the same same calculation. So we're just doing the same thing, right? First name, last name. And then all we need to do is, after we set the variable, the second line there is what we're going to return for the variable. So we'll jump out of that. We'll get the same variable, right? That's what we expect to happen. But we use a let statement. We're still using the set variable script, right? But see the same variable gets set there in our web or in our data viewer. So now we're going to go back in and change it up again. With let statements, they're nice because you can set multiple variables at one time. You can kind of stack them up, right? So I don't need just one variable. I want to set a couple at the same time. So how do we do that? I'm going to change it up here, right? Just we're going to have first name, and we're going to have last name on the second line, right? And then we're going to set another variable where we're going to put them together. So each line kind of ends with the semicolon, right? We can add a new line, set a new variable. So you'll notice on this one, I'm referencing the variables that we set in the steps above, right? Instead of the values from the field, because we set the variables, so as we step down, we got first name, last name, now we're going to put them together. Anytime you have multiple variables, we're going to denote that in the square brackets, right? So it's kind of an array of different variables that we're setting. So we just set that, and we're going to return the same thing, right? What the let statement returns, it's the same value, just a little bit different way of going at it. And you can see that there. So now we're going to go back in and we're going to do something a little bit different. Where we define those variables at, they were let variables, but you can also define local variables and global variables in the let statement. They're not just restricted to let variables, right? So now when we run this, right, we've got our local variable that was set in the let statement. So it might be a little confusing because we also returned that in our script step, right? Our set variable. So that's kind of why you saw it twice. So let's change that a bit, right? We're gonna do another one. But before that, I'll show you how to do the repetition. So we're going to specify, and this is just like repetitions in fields, right? But you're using the square brackets. We're going to set, the first one is basically repetition 1. You don't have to denote that, but now we're going to set like repetition 2. And in this case, it's going to have the same value, but see there, you see in the data viewer, those two got set. So there we had like 3 variables set. It's because that, what we're returning, that gets set. So if we set that to an empty string, right, we never even see that initial variable from the set variable. We're doing all our work in the let statement. So you don't even see that third one there. It's just the 2 that we set. And just as an example, add another $sign, now our scope changes, right? So now when we run this, that's a global variable. We'll see it persist after the lifetime of the script that gets run, right? So the script's done, but we still have our global variables. So those are going to be available to us for as long as the file's open. So that was kind of a simple example. Let me show you a little bit more complicated example. So don't get too freaked out like seeing all this stuff, right? I don't even understand this. This is a calculation that I found out on the internet. It's actually used for determining like what date that Easter falls on a given year, right? This was actually developed by a mathematician in the 40s. But the point is, it was easy to find that calculation and kind of paste it in without too much having to rework it too much for a FileMaker, be able to use a calculation like that. You know, another important thing from this that it wasn't so obvious from the other example was you have to kind of step through it, right? There's variables that get set at the top that you have to utilize down in the lower part. So it's not so easy to if you were just trying to write this out on one big long line, you wouldn't be able to do it without setting a couple variables in sequence. All right, so pop quiz now, staying with the scholastic theme. All right, I'm going to give you a question. What's the result of the following let statement? All right, we got let, contact equals first name, last name. We got our zip code, and then what we should return is the first, last name, and zip code, right? So let's see what happens when we do that. I'm just going to create a variable with the let statement, right, just in my data viewer, and I should see it evaluate. It's not evaluating. I actually get an error here. So why did I get the error? I got the error because contact was a table name. So this is what I refer to as a namespace collision, right? Contact was already, that namespace was already taken up, so we're going to get an error until we change. When we change it, then we see it evaluates properly. So, I want to talk about namespaces, and this falls under more best practices. But you should consider maybe using prefixes to namespace your variables. I used a couple like this or my, or if I'm using like merge variables in my user interface, I'll use like UI. Another standard that we have at Slant is anytime we use a global variable, we'll make it in all caps. Just so visually we know, without having to look for the extra little $sign, that should be a global variable, right? It is kind of an interesting note that variable names are not case sensitive. So you can't have like an uppercase name and a lowercase name that are the same. Those can occupy the same space. All right, now we know how to name and set variables. Where can we use them? So there's a lot of different places, right? Scripts, that's the obvious one we showed. And it's nice that we can loop through in calculations, right? Using the loop function to set variables or increment them. Calculations, right? Obviously, we showed that too. Custom functions, those kind of work pretty much the same way as field definitions, right? But you can also set variables for file references, external data sources. That was added in 16. That's kind of a neat thing. And then, of course, as on layouts as merge variables. So let's show an example of those. So we're going to start with loops in a script, right? We're just going to do something simple, right? We're going to start with a loop. We're going to go through and set a variable using the same like first name, last name. And then we're going to increment a variable, right? We set the one at the top, my account, and each time it loops through, it's going to add one to it. And then we've got an exit condition, right? Well, we don't need to sit here and watch it run forever. So after 5, we're just going to exit. So as we step through, you can see down in the data viewer, stuff changes, right? We can see our variables get set. Each time we go through, we're showing the value from the record that we're on, and we're incrementing our counter. So we go through after 5, right? Variables at 5, exit to the loop. So now we go to define a field, right? And this is that same Easter calculation. We change a couple things here. We can, set variables in our let statement, but you wouldn't necessarily want to do that in field definitions. Remember the whole you shouldn't do things. So for the most part, you wouldn't want to set either like a local or a global variable in your field definitions. So here we're going to show, we've set a variable to a path, right? This is not a calculation engine. This is where you specify like a file reference, right? Your file paths. So you'll notice there, we can specify a file path with a variable. So that's kind of what we're doing. Set the file path as a variable. Then when we export our records, we give it that variable, so we can dynamically tell FileMaker where we want to export out files or reference stuff with that file path. Then lastly, this was introduced in 16. We have the ability to dynamically define our external data sources. So I've got a couple different data files just kind of sitting out here, right? And I'm going to define them with a script. I set the variable. I have that external data source defined as a variable. So normally there would be a file path, whether it's relative or absolute, right? But instead of a file path, we're going to give it a variable. So as long as that variable is set, we can point to a different data source. Right, and you can see that when we go in here to our relationships, after that variable gets set, you can see the path back to where that file actually lives, right? Because, and remember, that's set with a variable. So a use case for that might be, I have a client that they have like a POS system. They have to deploy out to, they have like a local file, but each customer has a different FileMaker server. So it was always a pain trying to go and modify that, point that back to that customer's server. So now they can set it with a variable for each of their customers. So when they deploy those files, they're looking back to the correct data source. The thing to know about that is, and you can see there's different data from the two different files. Thing to know about it is, though, you want to set that variable right up front, right when you open the file, because before they hit a layout or anything that references that data source. So just make sure that that's set, and then it's kind of set there. So now merge variables, right? We can have variables right in our layouts. We go to add a merge variable, right? It basically just creates text. You could actually type that right in, right? So as long as you've got the $2 signs, and you can reference a variable right from there. So this is an example I did showing like localization. So all my labels for my fields are going to be variable or global variables, and you can see those set. There's a bunch of them set. In this solution, actually, and you can download this. I put up a link to it. I'm able to switch that, right? So if we want to show a different language, we just select that language, come back to our layout, and you can see all the labels have changed, right? So I just set those global variables. Then I just populate those global variables if I want to show a different value for them. All right, so moving on. Congratulations, you've all passed Variables 101. We're going to move right on to Variables 201, right? Sticking with the scholastic theme. Just think about how far you've all come, right? I had more hair back then. All right, so we're going to look at a few more advanced topics with variables. We're going to look at how to dynamically name and set a variable. And then a little bit about, do all variables get set as text? And we're going to take a look at that. So first of all, setting a dynamic variable, we go back to the solution I just showed, right? And we can see there's actually a table there kind of shown in a portal, and that's going to be my variable name and the value that we give it. So when I click the button to select what language to show, it's going to run a script. So it's just going to loop down through those records where I've got name, value, but to be able to name them dynamically, right, there's an evaluate function. So I'm going to evaluate a let statement where I kind of put everything together. So if you think of it as like the text for the let statement is all right in there. So when I evaluate it, it's going to allow me to set that variable name dynamically. I don't have to hard code going in, naming a variable with something that I know, right? I'm doing it dynamically from field data. And we can see that down there in the data viewer, right? I've got my so-called storm of variables there. And then when I click to run that script, the values for those variables are going to get set. We're using the same namespace, so the same variable name is just going to have a different value when we update it. So when we bring up when we go to set a variable, it tells us right there that the result must be text, right? So I want to test that. So we're going to go in, set a variable, and see right down there where it says like the result must be text. Well, I think that's lying. I don't think that's entirely accurate. In fact, variable will retain the scalar data type of whatever field that you've set it from. So if you set a date, it's going to retain it as a date. If you set it as a number, it's going to kind of retain that as a number. I'm using a container field just kind of as a little more extreme example, right? And I want to set a variable to a container. And we see in the data viewer, like we kind of get what we expect, right? It's just the text, whatever the file name was. But when we go to set it, you can see it was actually the data from the container. So it does retain the data type of the field that you give it. So now we're going to be moving into a couple more, little more advanced techniques, but we can use variables to do some performance testing. And we're going to show that here. We can show, determine like layout render order. So, you know, how do layouts render? When you first go into browse mode, do they render like back to front, render top to bottom? In fact, they're top to bottom. And we can show that with variables. Then we're going to show some variable usage and insert from URL. And there's a couple places in that. And then finally, I'm going to show you like a navigation framework, so how you can use variables in your user interface to provide a way to navigate around a file through your different layouts. So first, performance testing. First, we're going to take a script and we're going to set a variable at the top of the script, right? And we've got this function for getting the current milliseconds. Right, so we're just going to do a couple loops, and at the bottom we're going to set another variable, right? And then to see how long this script ran, it's just the difference between those two. So when we go to run it, we can see, oh, it ran in 292 milliseconds. And just so you know it's working, we'll bump that up a little bit. We're not actually doing too much in this loop, it's just a demonstration. So it takes a little bit longer to go through a few more times. So if you've got some complicated script and you want to test like, how long is my script taking to run, you can use that, set a variable up here, set one at the bottom, and just show the difference. So we're going to use the same kind of thing right in our layout, right? And I'm just using a button. This could be any object. And remember, anywhere you've got access to that calculation engine, you can set a variable. So one place to do that is in the hide objects when, right? There's your calculation engine. So we can go through and set our beginning variable, right? And then we'll put one at the bottom of our layout, because remember the layout renders top to bottom. And then we get the difference between those two variables. We're going to set that, remember, to a global, because globals we can show in our user interface, right? I'm just going to move that over a little bit. And we're going to show the result right there on the layout too with a merge variable. And this isn't a real complicated layout, so I don't expect it to take a whole lot of time. But if you wanted to, if you had, more going on in your layout, you could test it, see how long it's taken to load. So as soon as we exit layout mode and go into browse mode, all that's going to evaluate. All those calculations are going to fire and set the variables. So we can see the load time there at the bottom. I'll just show you again. You get a slightly different result. It's pretty quick, 1 millisecond. I'm not complaining too much. But that's a way to test it. All right, curl options. I know you're saying like this is a little more advanced, but I think it's actually not as bad as what you might think. And integrations are one of the more powerful things you can do with FileMaker. So we're just going to look at these real quick. A couple things to know. When you insert from URL, you can target a variable to set the result to. And this was new in 16. Before you had to have a field on the layout that was going to be your target. Now you don't even need that. You can set it directly to a variable. You don't even have to define that ahead of time. You can just set it right here, right? Whatever I'm doing my insert from, just set it to that variable. So next thing to know is when you refer to a variable in your curl options, you want to do it with like an @ mark. And notice that my variable there on the second line, right, it's inside the quote marks, which is a little unintuitive at first. But really what you're saying with the @ mark is when you're handing this off to the curl engine, right, you're saying, where is my data? It's at this address. So it makes a little more sense there. Another one to note too, there's a curl flag for dump header. This is real important for working with different web services. A lot of them don't give any kind of response, right? Except it's in the actual HTTP headers. So you can define a variable here that's going to show all that. So I'm going to bring up my script workspace. This is my insert from URL script, right? And you can see I'm setting a URL, and then I'm just going to go set this is just a sample, setting like a little bit of JSON, right? Nothing special. My curl options here. We look at this calculation. Right, so this is just referencing where my variable gets set. Notice it's inside the my quote marks here. All right, and then I'm going to dump all my headers out, and those are going to be available in this variable here. So what does that look like in the actual insert from URL script step? Right, we got to look at the options. So my target, I'm going to target the result of going out, hitting that server, whatever it's going to return, it's going to go back to this variable. My URL gets set up here. This is where you would replace whatever. And I've written a PHP script. Basically all it does, it's just going to hand back to me whatever I give it. So I know that what I'm sending to it is actually getting there. We'll see that when I run it. And then my curl options, I set my curl options to a variable in a different one, right? But we could write them right there. And then finally, we'll just write those out to a couple different fields so we can see them in the database. So when I go to run this, so there you can see this is what my PHP script returned. This is the JSON that I sent to it. So it's just showing me back what I sent to it. This is the interesting one, the headers, right? You wouldn't normally see this in the response. And this can be important to integrating with different web services. So, and just to run that again, we'll step through it, right? Set the first variable, set some JSON, and you can see these kind of getting built up, right? There's your JSON. That's what we're going to send. And then we get back those, the result, right? Notice that it's a local variable. That's why we set it. That's why you set it back to a field. If we set it to a global, we'd be able to inspect it, right, in the data viewer here after the script run. But we're going to set those to a field, right? So it's going to be the same kind of thing. So that's that one. Okay. Any questions so far? Yep, good. All right. We're going to go back to this reference, right? Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. So for this next example, it's going to show you like an exception to that. This is my navigation framework that I did. And we don't need to get too far into this, but I did want to show, it's a nice example. I've actually got 3 different button bars, right? If we go into layout mode, and these are all showing something different. In fact, like a lot of them have let statements built right into them, right? To display an output where we're showing a variable getting set. But we don't need to get too far into that. The idea here is that each of these are a variable. And when I click on the button, that goes to a script, and what it hands off to the script is what layout to navigate to, right? So you'll see all these different layouts. And the idea here is that you've got a top tier, a second tier that shows the layouts that relate to that top tier, and there's even a third tier, like it doesn't show here because it doesn't have anything to show, but like this, so company contacts, and there's 3 different layouts. And you'll notice, if I bring up the layout list here, those are my layout names. So what I'm doing is I'm going down, and there's a design function, right, for getting all the layout names. So as long as they're in order, I've got a delimiter set, right? In this case, it's a double underscore. So this is kind of a map, right? It's like delimited data. So we can parse through that, and we can set variables dynamically to show in our user interface. So that's really what I'm exploiting here, right, to give my navigation framework. So this is something that I've actually used it in projects, and it's handy if I've just got some file that I use to throw on it real quick. There's only a couple scripts involved, right? You want to load the navigation when you first open the thing. That's where all these things get set. But I mean, you don't have to do anything here to use it. You just copy in a couple scripts, right? The load navigation and your main one to navigate. So all the buttons go back through this navigation layout. So if you needed to modify it, you could do it here. But by default, it just goes to the layout based on what you hand to it. So the point of this is, one of the nice things, say I want to move about us after contacts, right? So in this situation, all I'd have to do is find the about us, right, and drag it down. I want it to appear after that. So, and since these are global variables, right, they're going to last for the duration of the session. So if I were to close this and open it, go back into recent. So now about us is after contacts. Here we're kind of putting together some of the other things I showed you about setting variables in your layout. And again, this is kind of one of the exceptions that, because in this case, if we ran a script to set all the variables, it's kind of too late, right? If we navigate to a layout and run a script, the layout's already rendered. So I need my variables to be set before the layout or as it's rendering. This to set up, like, it needs to know like where it's at. And I'm actually doing that in here. Have a calculation for what the active segment is. So you can see, like, this is where I'm doing a lot of my work. Again, like, this isn't something that you would normally have to do. You wouldn't normally come in here, but just to show you where that stuff is at. Another interesting thing, you may have noticed that, you know, I've got these little icons. So if I look at the data viewer, those are actually in the name of the variable. So those are actually what do you call them? Emojis, right? Those are valid UTF characters. So you can name a variable with a little icon if you want, and then when I go to display the variable, right, it's kind of displaying as an icon. But those are really like emojis. So in this file too, I've linked to this too, if you want to take a look at that. And then that's all I've got. We can end a little early if there's any questions. Yep.
Thank you for that presentation. So in the instance where you were sending the JSON information to the PHP file to get that information back, just to confirm that your request was accepted, I'm assuming is why you were doing that?
Right.
So what would you pass to it if what was on the server was JSON and you wanted to retrieve an element from the JSON in the form of a variable?
So that's going to be entirely dependent on whatever web service you're talking to. They all have like different requirements. Most of them nowadays are what they call RESTful, right? So you have to send it whatever it's asking for, and then it'll return you. You know, if it's RESTful, it'll most likely return you JSON. But some of them have the option of like returning you XML or whatever. Those usually come in the form of the body of that request, right? But then you can also get the headers too.
Okay, great. So, thank you.
Good, thanks. Anyone else? No? Right, this session. Oh.
I was just going to ask if the videos are available for download as well that were in your presentation of the demos.
I can post that, yeah. And I know this is being recorded. I don't know when the recording of the session goes out, but yeah, okay. So this may have updates if I need to update anything. Oh, another question?
I'm not sure I caught the concept. When you're talking about variable file paths, I can in my database specify that a document will be saved. If I want to print a PDF, for instance, and save it to a particular already existing file, I can do that by naming a variable file path?
That's correct, yes. Assuming that you have rights to overwrite that file, it'll overwrite it if you get the same name.
Hallelujah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep, so thanks for coming. Remember to fill out your evaluations, and I always like hearing feedback, but thanks for coming and enjoy DEF CON.